Gunter was one such man, who scratched out a living in Lincoln, or rather in a piss-poor village nearby known as Greetwell, though Gunter, who'd never known better, counted the place home. The sun hung low in the sky as he hefted the heavy peats from his punt. He pushed them up onto the river bank so that his daughter, Royce, and her brother, Hankin, could carry them to the lean-to shelter beside the cottage and stack them ready to burn through the long winter months. As usual, Royce was trying to outdo her brother, and they were piling them under the reed thatch with such haste that Gunter warned them to take more care. "Get a good steadle laid first, else the old stack'll tumble down." But he might as well have been talking to the wind. Royce, just coming up to 14, was a headstrong, wiry little lass. The first signs of womanhood were pushing out the front of her kirtle, but she still behaved more like a boy than a woman, never walking when she could run, never sitting still if she could climb. Hankin, a good year or so younger, was already taller than his sister, shooting up like a sapling, and just as skinny. Ever since he'd managed to pull himself to his little feet and toddle after her, he'd been determined to prove himself tougher than her, but she'd never made it easy for him. Gunter blew on his numbed hands to warm them. It was a raw day, the wind sharp and wet, the ground sodden after all the rain. He'd be glad when the frosts came. The damp ate deep into the bones. Great pools still covered the fields where the river had flooded. It had at last receded, but it would take longer to drain from the land. They'd waded through stinking river water inside the cottage for nigh on a week before it had gone, but they were used to that. It happened most years, and Gunter could read the river like the back of his hand. He knew when to shift kegs and barrels up to the hayloft, so little was lost. With the last of the peats safe on the bank, he hauled himself out of the punt and picked his way down the muddy track, eager for something warm to fill his belly. He was a short, stocky man, and the muscles of his arms and legs were thick and corded from years of punting. Despite the cold, he wore only a sleeveless tunic of stained brown homespun, which reached down to his thighs, and breeches so faded and grimy that it was hard to tell if they'd ever owned a colour. He walked with a strange gait, heaving his left leg out in an arc until he could place it flat directly beneath him. On the water, his element, he appeared no different from other men, but on land the stranger's gaze was immediately drawn to his leg. He had tried many different shapes of wooden leg over the years, spending the long winter evenings whittling whenever he had a fresh idea and could find a good piece of wood. But finally he had settled on this as being best for balancing on the punt as his body twisted, and for spreading his weight as he limped across the boggy ground around his home. His cottage huddled close to the river bank on one of the few firm patches of ground between the river and the edge, a ridge of cliff that ran behind the fields and marshlands. The main village of Greetwell sat high on the edge, safe from floods and the midges that swarmed over the bogs and mires below in summer. But a boatman couldn't live up there. He'd lose hours each day traipsing to and from his punt, precious hours when he should be earning. Besides, Gunter had lived by the river all his life, and couldn't sleep without the sound of water rushing through his dreams. He pressed down on the latch and pushed against the door, swollen and warped after the flood. The stench of damp and river mud rolled out. The bunches of dried herbs and onions hanging from the rafters rocked in the sudden draught as he stepped inside. He closed the door hastily behind him as a billow of smoke swirled up from the fire. The single-roomed cottage was a tight squeeze for 5 people, but Gunter had never known bigger. 2 beds occupied the space against the walls on either side, with shelves above to store boxes and clay jars. The rest of the room was pretty much taken up with a table and stools, but they needed little else. Nonny glanced up briefly as her husband entered, and straightway spooned pottage into a wooden bowl from the pot hanging over the fire. She didn't need to be told that her husband was hungry.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it. at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.